for now, I'm going to go straight into our presentation. So today, we're super lucky to be joined by Ally at Birds Canada. Ally is their Swiftwatch program coordinator, and she's going to tell us all about swifts and swallows. So I'm going to move over to Ally's window here. Hello, Ally. All right, you're up.
All right, good morning, everybody. I will just share my screen and jump right in. Okay, hopefully everybody. So my name is Ally Manthorne, and I work with Birds Canada as their Maritime Swiftwatch coordinator. A little bit about me first. I worked with Birds Canada for about 10 years and I started out as a field tech. I was very lucky to do bird surveys in the Cape Breton National Highlands Park and around other parts of the Highlands, and also in northern New Brunswick. So this was a great job for me as a kind of a budding biologist because I got to go hiking, I got to go camping, I just got to count birds all day and get to know New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. So that was a great start for me. I actually became interested in birds when I was in university at UVic in BC, and I took a vertebrate biology class, and most of it was actually birds. We learned about mammals and reptiles too, but a lot of the field trips involved going out to a local park and looking for birds. So that got me hooked, and I started looking for bird biology jobs, and that got me out here. So now I coordinate the aerial insectivore conservation program, and I'm based out of Sackville, New Brunswick. So this morning, we only have 15 minutes, so I'm not going to go into crazy detail about these species, but what we'll do is we'll do a little intro about what are aerial insectivores, what makes them so cool, why are they in trouble, and then briefly go over these 5 species here. And then we'll talk about how we can help. So first things first, what are aerial insectivores? Now that's a bit of a mouthful, but essentially what it means is these are birds that catch flying insects while in flight.
Sorry, Ally, I think we're on the wrong slide here. We're still on the first slide.
Are you still on the first slide?
Yeah.
Now, why are my slides not progressing? Wonder what we can do about that. So if I move the slide over, is that changing the slides at all?
No, what we see is the PowerPoint presentation window.
Or are they still on the first page?
Yeah, still on the first page there. But it's actually in the PowerPoint presentation window and not as if you're presenting it now. Wonder if that's the.
I'm experiencing a bit of a lag here. So I didn't hear that last part.
Oh, sorry. I think the PowerPoint window is the one that's up. So we can't see the actual presentation. It's just, yeah, it's as if you're opening it up to edit it, and it's on that first screen.
Okay. Now, sorry about that.
Oh, that's all right. It wouldn't be online learning without tech issues.
So let's try that again. That's me.
Yep.
With my round of concentration. How's that?
We see about me.
Okay, perfect.
Great.
So, we are at this slide. So what are aerial insectivores? So like I said, aerial insectivores are birds that catch flying insects while they are in flight. So you won't see these birds hopping along the ground and picking up insects off the ground necessarily. What they're doing is chasing those insects that are flying around. So these are some examples of aerial insectivores. We've got flycatchers, like the olive-sided flycatcher that we have in Nova Scotia. Nightjars, That includes whippoorwills and common nighthawks. The swifts, we only have one species of swift in eastern Canada, and that's the chimney swift. And then our swallows. So we've got barn swallows, tree swallows, cliff swallows, bank swallows. Those are the most common swallows that you'll see in Nova Scotia. All of these birds are specially adapted to hunt insects. So they've got nice large eyes, they've got pointed long wings that allow them to fly with agility and with speed. And they've got these huge mouths. So when they're opening their beaks, they can scoop up those insects. So I just wanted to reference this report. This is the State of Canada's Birds that was published in 2019, and it goes over about 40 years of bird data and breaks down kind of what's happening with different groups of birds and what their population status is. So this graphic is from that report, and what it shows here is the lines that are trending upwards, sloping upwards, are representing populations that are increasing. So at the very top, you've got waterfowl, ducks and geese, and you can see that their populations have increased by about 150% since data started being collected in the 1970s. So they're doing very well. And then as you move down the graph, you can see the lines that are sloping downwards, and these lines represent populations that are in decline. So unfortunately, at the very bottom, you can see this purple mauve kind of color line, and those are the aerial insectivores. So they are declining more steeply than any other group of birds in Canada. And when you think about what these aerial insectivores have in common, they're birds that eat flying insects in flight. So we suspect that a loss of insects or a decline in the quality or the amount of insects is probably what's driving this decline. Of course, each of these birds has a slightly different habitat, and so there are actually several factors that are contributing to these declines, including habitat loss, climate change, human persecution. And what I mean by human persecution is sometimes these birds are nesting or roosting in areas that humans don't like. So sometimes people will actually remove the nests to get rid of the birds. So unfortunately, there's quite a few threats, and that's why you're seeing aerial insectivores really at the bottom of this graph. So now I'll just go through those 5 species one by one. And I don't have time to really dive deep into each species, but if you're interested in learning more, you can always go online and get to know each of these birds. And I find the more you get to know about them, the more you really love and respect them. Each of them is really pretty cool in its own right. So first of all, we have the barn swallow. So you can identify the barn swallow by its brown face and its iridescent blue back and kind of pale buff belly. Barn swallows have a deeply forked tail, and they have a beautiful kind of squeaky voice, which I'll play for you in a second. So barn swallows are found all across Canada, and they're very easy to find with their mud nest cup. So how they build this nest cup is they fly to a muddy spot like a mud puddle or a riverbank, and they pick up a scoop of mud and they bring it back to where they're building their nest, and they glue it to the wall. And they'll take hundreds of trips back and forth to build this nest, and they'll reinforce the nest with horsehair or straw until they've got this nice nest cup. And barn swallows often use the same nest cup the next year. So one really important thing to do is if you see a barn swallow nest, just leave it in place so the bird can use it again the next year. Now, barn swallows have declined by about 75% in Canada, and they're considered endangered in Nova Scotia. And some of the reasons behind their population decline are the loss of barns, so old barns that they can move in and out of through windows are being torn down because they're getting too old. And also they're losing their food source, so those flying insects that they need are harder to find. And also, barn swallows, unfortunately, are sometimes removed from barns because people don't like where they're nesting, or they think they're going to make a mess or spread diseases. So they are also sometimes threatened by that human persecution that I mentioned before. So now I'll just play the barn swallow call for you.
So cute.
It's kind of a fun little squeaky sound. So next time you hear that sound, you can look up and hopefully you'll see a barn swallow. The next one is cliff swallow, which is not actually that different from barn swallow from far away, but you can tell them apart because cliff swallows don't have a forked tail, and they have that nice little white patch on their forehead, and they have a little white patch on their rump, which is the base of their tail. Cliff swallows also make mud nests, but as you can see here, that nest is more like a pod shape. So it's totally enclosed and it's got this little tube-shaped entrance. And cliff swallows usually nest on the outside of buildings, whereas barn swallows often nest on the insides. That's not always the case, but that's kind of typical for these two birds. Cliff swallows are also declining, but not as steeply as barn swallows. And they face a number of threats. A lot of them are the same as barn swallows. So a loss of insect prey, habitat loss, and sometimes when they nest on the outside of buildings, those nests get scraped off because they're considered too messy. So a lot of people think that this sound sounds like two balloons being rubbed together, which I like. So next up we have the tree swallow. Tree swallow is easy to identify because it's got this beautiful kind of bluish, greenish, iridescent back and a pure white belly. They also don't have a forked tail. Tree swallows are the first swallows to come back every spring. They're a little bit more cold hardy than the other swallows, but they're also, because they come back so much earlier, they're also susceptible to cold snaps. So a couple weeks ago, we had a little bit of snow. So these birds would be having more trouble finding insects when it's that cold, and they're going to be using a lot more energy to keep warm instead of putting that energy towards nesting. Tree swallows, like the name suggests, used to nest inside the hollows of trees, so cavities, but they've adapted to using nest boxes. So we have nest boxes in our backyard here, and we're just starting to get tree swallows back. And when we check the nest box, if you look inside, you'll notice that tree swallows often use feathers from other species like ducks to line their nest. So sometimes if you peek inside carefully, you can see these beautiful, long, fluffy feathers from molted ducks. Tree swallows are also declining, not as steeply as barn swallows, but they face a lot of the same threats. So that loss of insect prey, habitat loss, meaning the loss of those cavity trees, not so much human persecution, but they're also affected by climate change. So as our climate is changing, we're seeing more severe cold snaps in the spring, more kind of long, rainy periods. And when that happens, it's really hard for these birds to find the insects that they need. So tree swallows have kind of a liquidy trilling call, a lot different from cliff swallow. So bank swallow is one swallow that not as many people have seen because they're not nesting as close to our houses as some of the other species of swallow. So bank swallows are a lot smaller, and they're kind of a charcoal grayish brown, and they've got this dark gray band across their belly, and that helps us pick them out from other swallows while they're flying. As their name suggests, bank swallows often nest in riverbanks or coastal bluffs, and what they're looking for is soft soil or sand that's being eroded by water and waves. And when they get these kind of vertical cliff faces, they can burrow in and make their nest inside these tunnels. So you can see those tunnels here on the right-hand side. Bank swallows are declining very steeply. They've declined by about 98% in Canada, and they're also considered endangered in Nova Scotia. And some of the threats they face are really habitat specific. So, especially on the Northumberland coast, shoreline hardening is happening a lot more. And shoreline hardening is basically when we put large boulders or blocks along the shoreline to try to slow down erosion. So what this does is it kind of blocks off that habitat and makes it unavailable for bank swallows. Also, hydroelectric dams can impact the availability of habitat because they change the flow of water. So you're not getting that kind of scouring of the riverbank that produces that nice cliff face for the birds. Bank swallows are also losing their food source, so that availability of insects is a problem. And they're long distance migrants, so they're also susceptible to strong storms and other things that they encounter as they're migrating to South America. So that bank swallow is really just a dry, buzzy sort of sound. Next up, we have chimney swift. So also kind of charcoal brown like the bank swallow, but you can see that the silhouette of a chimney swift is very different. So it has this kind of bow and arrow or boomerang silhouette, and it's got a really short, stubby tail, and it's more uniform gray on the belly. So it doesn't have that belly band. Chimney swifts are found in eastern North America, excuse me, and they're found all across New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And what's really cool about chimney swifts is that as they're moving north, they're stopping at these kind of communal roost sites, so large chimneys, and they'll group together at night and they'll circle around this chimney and then they'll all drop in for the night. And they do this while they're on migration, but then when it's time to breed in late May or early June, they'll actually split off in pairs and leave that roost chimney and go nest in an individual chimney. So only one pair of chimney swifts will nest in a chimney. That's kind of surprising to a lot of people. If you've been to Wolfville or New Glasgow and you see these hundreds of chimney swifts all dropping into a chimney together, a lot of us assume that that's a nesting colony, but that's not actually the case. Chimney swifts have a really special nest that's really unique from other birds. So they have a sticky saliva, and they'll break off a twig in the air as they're flying around, and they'll bring it back to their nest and they'll glue it to the wall with their sticky saliva, and then they'll go back and get another twig. And if you look on the bottom right, you'll see that that nest is made of a whole bunch of twigs just glued together with special sticky spit. And it takes about 3 weeks to do this. So a lot of time put into that nest building. Another really neat thing about chimney swifts is they have very short legs and very large feet. So chimney swifts can't actually walk or perch like other birds. So you'll never see them sitting in a tree or hopping along the ground because their legs are just too short to support them. So instead, they actually cling to the sides of chimneys and trees, and they also have these little tail spikes on their tail, which you can see in this picture. And those tail spikes act as a kind of brace. So they're really specially adapted to clinging vertically, and this sets them apart from those other birds. So chimney swift populations have declined by about 90% in Canada, and they're also considered endangered in Nova Scotia. Because they nest and roost inside chimneys and sometimes barns, they're really at risk of being disturbed when, for example, we sweep our chimneys in the summer, or if it's a cold spring night and we need to light a fire, that can really harm a chimney swift if they're back already. So those are some of the main threats. As well, we don't really build chimneys the way that we used to anymore. We usually just have heating vents. And so because we're losing that chimney habitat, and we're also losing their original habitat, because of course we didn't always have chimneys. Chimney swifts used to nest inside hollow trees, and we've really lost most of that old growth forest that would produce those old hollow trees that have rotted out in the middle. So chimney swifts are facing kind of a double whammy of habitat loss. They're losing their chimneys, and they're also still losing those trees. So that habitat loss is a big factor in the decline. And of course, the availability and the quality of the insects they eat is probably another big one. Another way that they're being threatened through climate change is through hurricanes. So we're seeing stronger hurricanes and more frequent hurricanes as our climate changes. And because chimney swifts migrate during the hurricane season, they are sometimes kind of caught up in those big storms, and they can be killed or they can be brought back up to where they started and then have to start migrating all over again. So they're using huge supplies of energy to do that. So climate change is probably really affecting these birds. And as well, like I mentioned with tree swallows, those cold snaps or heat waves that we're seeing more and more are making it harder for them to hunt for insects. So I'll play the sound for you. This is one of the best ways that I can find chimney swifts. I usually hear them before I see them. They've got this really high-pitched twittering sound, and they fly so far up in the air that the best way to look for chimney swifts or try to find chimney swifts is by using your ears first and then following that sound. So it's kind of like an electrical sound. So I've mentioned a lot of different threats, and it's kind of hard when you think about things like climate change or this widespread decline in insects to really think about what we can do to help. But at a more local level, there's lots of things that we can do, especially because habitat is one of the kind of features that I've mentioned a lot that is being threatened. So what Birds Canada does is we do a lot of surveys and we engage the public to look for and report nest and roost sites. And when we do find a new nest or roost site, we work with the landowners to try to conserve that habitat. So what we'll do is provide information to them, give them advice about things that they can do or that they should avoid doing to make sure that they're maintaining kind of a bird-friendly habitat. And then we also monitor chimney swifts and swallows at their roost and nest sites. And the data that we collect helps us study how different threats and the actions that we're doing are influencing the populations at our more regional scale. So normally at this time of year, we would be going out to chimney swift roost sites across Nova Scotia, and we'd be counting the number of birds that are coming back at certain dates. And we're actually doing this across Canada. And what that does is gives us kind of a snapshot in time of how many swifts are in the region and how many are in each chimney. But we're not able to do that this year because of coronavirus. Luckily, we have enough years worth of data to let us skip a year without really affecting our data too much. So we hope to be back on track with roost counts next year. So how can we help at that local scale? So really the best thing we can do is be good hosts. If you live in an area and you're seeing barn swallows or cliff swallows and you have a barn or a shed, if you just leave a window open or a door, that will give those birds a chance to move freely in and out of the barn or shed, so that they can deliver food to their chicks and go hunting for insects. This one is pretty obvious, but sometimes there's a perfectly good barn and the doors are closed at night because people don't want people don't want their animals to get out or people to come in. So sometimes just leaving a window open is a really good way to help these birds. And this helps out barn swallows, cliff swallows, and chimney swifts, which also sometimes nest inside barns. Next one's pretty fun, make some mud. So a lot of people have horses or other animals, or they have a gravel driveway or mud driveway. So usually there's a little bit of mud. And if you have barn swallows or cliff swallows, they need that fresh mud to build their nests. And if there's no mud around, what you can do is just run your hose for a few minutes, make a puddle, and then they'll get mud that way. I mentioned this before. If you have barn swallow nests or cliff swallow nests, or even chimney swift nests, don't take them down at the end of the year because those birds will often come back and reuse those nests. And if they can use an old nest, then that saves them a lot of energy and time that they don't have to use building a new nest. And they can put that towards their eggs. Another thing you can do if you live in an appropriate area, so you have a bit of yard space, is put up nest boxes. And these are specifically for tree swallows, but you might often find eastern bluebirds will use them, and even chickadees. We've had chickadees using our nest boxes before. It's important when you build a nest box to make sure that it's high enough that it's out of reach of predators like cats or raccoons. And then this one is more tailored towards kind of farmland, but these birds all need flying insects. So in areas that have marshes or ponds, pastures, even just the sides of the road that have a little bit of vegetation growing up, wet areas especially produce insects. So a lot of the insects that these birds are eating have an aquatic stage of their life cycle. So what you can do is just leave areas wet, leave them a little bit wild, and that will produce insects that will feed these birds. And of course, the last thing is being a citizen scientist. So all of our programs really rely on citizen science to collect data and for people to go where we wouldn't be able to go and make observations that we wouldn't necessarily be able to make with the number of staff that we have. And so the data that citizen scientists collect is really important to help us figure out where these birds are and how they're doing, and some of the threats that are affecting them. So there's a few different ways that you can be involved. And Laura talked about eBird last week. So eBird's really good. You can use it in your backyard or on your balcony. What you're doing is just looking at all the birds that you can find and submitting a list of birds that we can later see and use to kind of hone in on hotspots where we think there might be birds like chimney swift roosts, but we haven't found them yet. Another fun project is Project Nest Watch. So if you can find a nest, you'll watch the nest and you'll collect data on what kind of nest it is, what kind of bird it is, when the eggs are hatching, how the chicks are doing, and that helps scientists look at populations and kind of tie threats to nest success. So it's a fun project. We're looking at a chickadee nest right now in our yard, and we'll be following that throughout the season to see how they do. And we're hoping that they break the record. Last year they laid 10 eggs, so we'll see if they can do that again this year.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's it for me. It was a little bit long, I'm sorry. I have a video that I can show if we have time, but I can also skip it if we're short on time. But I wanted to say thank you very much for inviting me to share with you this morning. And also thanks to all of our volunteers across New Brunswick and Nova Scotia who put in so many hours, and also all of our project partners and our supporters. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Ally. We've got some good questions here. Some about the bird's biology and ecology, and some about how we can help scientists monitor these insectivores. Let's start with these. I guess we've got a couple questions about. We learned about a couple of different birds and why they're all at risk in Nova Scotia and in Canada for a lot of them for very similar reasons. So we have a couple questions about the official listings of these species. So we have talked about in previous sessions how species are assessed for being at risk and how they get their designation. But maybe you could tell us more about how our barn swallows, our chimney swifts, how they came to be listed, and which ones are, I guess, you would consider to be the most at risk right now in Nova Scotia.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's a formal process for assessing the populations of birds in Canada and other species, actually, not just birds. And so the Committee on the Status of Wildlife in Canada, CSIWIC, meets every so often, and they go over all the data, and they would write a report and say, okay, this species has declined a lot since last time we assessed it, or this species is doing better, or it's doing about the same. And they recommend a listing to Environment Canada, and then that species is either put on the species at risk registry or not. So all of these birds have been studied very closely, and based on the rate of the population decline, they've been considered endangered or threatened, or maybe special concern if the population is starting to drop off, but it's not really at risk yet, or they're considered non-endangered. So that's why barn swallow and chimney swift and bank swallow are considered endangered in Nova Scotia. And nationally, they're not endangered, they're actually threatened. But in Nova Scotia, their populations have really declined, specifically in the province. So they're kind of one up.
Mm. I imagine probably a lot of our young naturalists are a little too young to remember this, but I know when I was a kid, and even when I was starting my field studies, which wasn't that long ago, it was a lot buggier out there. I don't know if anybody, maybe our parents online today, have noticed a pretty serious reduction in our flying insects in the last few years. I know when I was outside as a kid, especially in black fly season, like it was awful. So I'm not complaining about that now, but I know that has very important implications for our aerial insectivores. So if you guys are lucky enough to live somewhere kind of boggy and kind of wet, maybe that's a good place to be looking for some of these birds. I wonder, we didn't really talk about this in your presentation, Ally, but is there any way to be a good bug steward besides keeping those wet areas around?
Well, it's more it this applies more to like farms, but reducing the use of pesticides is a really big one. So if you don't have to use a certain pesticide, or you can use a little bit less, that's great. At home, we certainly don't use any sprays or anything in our yard, and we also have we have a lawn, but we don't actually mow it anymore. So anything you can do to kind of create a little wild space in your yard is really good for those insects.
There are a couple questions here about helping scientists monitor birds. So we talked about eBird in a couple sessions, even before we got to Laura's presentation last week. And we talked a little bit about when you find a species at risk and how you should responsibly report those. And we talked about eBird a little bit. But I wonder if you could tell us more about, when you're outside being a citizen scientist and you think you've got a species at risk, if it's one of these really cool aerial insectivore birds, is eBird a safe way to report them? Is it better to go straight to Maritime Swiftwatch? What's the preferred way for sharing that data?
Yeah, that's a really good question. For more sensitive species, when you report on eBird, you can choose to make the specific location invisible. So you're reporting it and it shows up to other people as kind of a broader location. And that helps birds, because if it's a rare species and everybody wants to come see it, they won't be able to find it specifically, and they won't be disturbed as much. When you are out there and you're finding chimney swifts and barn swallows and bank swallows, especially if it's on a property that's not your own property, we like to be contacted directly, and that way we can talk to you a little bit about what you saw and where it was, and hopefully connect with those landowners. And that helps because all of that information is not as public. So eBird's great for sharing your bird lists, and it's really great because it has those settings that you can kind of obscure the location if you need to, and that helps protect those sensitive species.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we didn't talk about that in some of our earlier sessions. There's a lot of private land out there in Nova Scotia, and you want to be careful with the kinds of things you're reporting on land that isn't your own or isn't public. So that's a good point. We have a question here about the actual nest structures. So in the case of the barn swallow, for example, does that muddy structure on the side of a barn hurt the wood at all, or does it just kind of sit there and dry out the rest of the year? I would imagine it's kind of wet in the early days when they're forming it.
That's a really good question, and I'm not an expert on that, so I won't speak with any authority. But as soon as they build it, it starts to dry out, and that's good for the barn swallows because they don't want their nest to be kind of crumbly or kind of slide off the wall. So it does dry out. I don't think it hurts the wood. Um, when it does fall off, it kind of leaves like a little bit of a muddy ring, so you can tell where they used to be, but I don't think it rots the wood or anything.
Hmm. And is it safe to get close to the nest if you're doing your citizen science? How close is too close before you're going to start disturbing the birds?
Yeah, so Project Nest Watch has a protocol with all of those kind of tips and tricks and rules laid out. And just briefly, one of the recommendations is if you can see if you can hear the chicks and then you can see them, you need to stay away, because if you do approach the nest and those chicks are kind of almost ready to fly, but they haven't quite mastered flying yet, you can actually scare them out of the nest and then they'll be at risk. So um, there's kind of different ways of going about it, but if you can see those little heads popping out, then you just keep your distance, keep your respectful distance. And it's really, I mean, it's good to get the data, but it's more important to make sure that those species are safe and undisturbed.
Yeah, thanks for joining us for Swifts and Swallows today. And thank you, Ally, so much for joining and telling us all about these really cool birds that I knew very little about.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
There's something cool coming up, or was coming up, at the Young Naturalist Club. Before the pandemic happened, we were planning on taking a trip out to just outside of Wolfville to do some birding around Boot Island National Wildlife Area, which is in the Bay of Fundy. And we've had to postpone that trip, of course, into the fall. So if you're not already a member of the Young Naturalist Club, you can follow us on Facebook, check out our website, and we'll be updating folks on that trip over the summer or by September at least when we have our plans sorted out. Yeah, so that'll be a fun trip where we'll go learn about shorebirds for sure. But we're also hoping to take a trip over to Wolfville and maybe see that the chimney. Hopefully that's not too late. Really, the best time to be seeing our swifts is now, but you never know. We might get lucky if it's in a nice warm year. All right, guys. Well, that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining us. Allie and I are going to sign off now. So send in your answers to that email. If you have any questions, you can send them to that email as well. And stay tuned. We're going to be sharing posts from Maritime Swiftwatch, maybe that video that Allie has, and more info about how you can be a good swift and swallow steward. Okay. Bye, guys.